So life in the South was definitely very different than the industrial life that we described in the North. Um, the South primarily is still going to be an agriculturally based economy, and agriculture is still going to drive the culture and the population in the South. With the creation of the cotton gin invented by Eli Whitney, what this did was it was a machine that was able to separate the seeds from the cotton, and it made harvesting the cotton a lot faster. And so now plantation owners were able to speed up their harvest process, which allowed the workers in the North to receive the cotton sooner and would be able to create more cotton goods. And so this created what we call the cotton boom, right? And so with the cotton boom, it's really going to transform the Southern agricultural life. And of course, there's positive and negative effects to these things. First of all, positively, because of the cotton boom, cotton became such a prized commodity that it definitely increased the economy of the South. There was a buildup of wealth throughout the southern states, and a lot more southern states and farmers began to focus on planting cotton. The South itself became a major world player in world trade because not only were we trading cotton to our northern states, but also cotton was being traded with other countries. And so the South became a huge participant in this whole world trade system regarding cotton. There was the development of the cotton trade itself and the growth of cotton related industries because it also had an effect in the North because now you began to see more mills popping up because there was more cotton, and so more industries related to using cotton was also developed. Negatively, though, that meant that the southern states relied on cotton and only cotton to make a living. So there was this reliance on just one crop, cotton, and that's why it was called the king crop or king cotton. Um, Slavery became even more of an embedded institution in the South because since we relied on cotton and we needed the cotton harvest, even more slaves and were needed, slave labor was needed to be able to make this happen. So there was an increase of the internal slave trade within the South itself. Now, usually when we think of the South, we always have this vision of these huge plantations and just these huge plantation owners throughout the South. But in reality, when you compare the entire white population of the South, plantations and plantation owners, or what were known as planters, really made up a very small population. They were a small percentage of the total white population. The fact is that the largest number of white farmers were known as yeoman farmers. And these farmers actually owned very few slaves, five maybe at most, some none at all, right? And this was primarily the largest group of farmers that you found in the South. Then you had the very poor white farmers, which were known as tenant farmers, who actually had to rent off pieces of the land that they lived off. They rented that land and farmed it, and really what they grew was in order to feed themselves and their family. Now, of course, slave labor still is the biggest institution in the South. Slave labor is still something that you're going to see throughout all of the southern states. And slaves had different roles and different jobs depending on what type of slave they were, right? They primarily worked in three different areas. You either had the slave who worked in the field, and these were primarily slaves who were out there then planting and harvesting cotton or working with the animals. So these were out in the field day in and day out. Then you had the house slaves, right? These were your cooks and your maids and your servants and your nannies who worked inside the home itself. Usually these slaves, right, had a little bit of an easier time when in comparison to those in the field. It wasn't as grueling work. Most of the time, these types of slaves were slaves who were lighter skinned than other slaves that the farmers then kept in the house. Um, and then you had the slaves that had skilled jobs, right? These were slaves who had some type of actual skill, like blacksmiths, right? Something like that. And these were the three different types of work or labor that slaves had throughout the South. And we think of the institution of slavery and we think of all of these slaves in the South who were slaves for hundreds of years, these generations of families that were slaves. And we don't really think about the fact that even though this was happening, it doesn't mean that slaves didn't actually challenge or try to resist slavery in some way. And it didn't always happen with a rebellion, right? Slaves found other ways to try and challenge the institution of slavery, right? One way that they tried to challenge the institution of slavery was by working slower, right? Because they knew that the white farmers depended on the harvest to be able to make money. So they figured that if they worked slower, they would harm the economy in that sense. So by actually slowing production and by slowing down the work that you did was one way of kind of challenging that institution. Another challenge to slavery was running away, right? You had a number of slaves who tried to run away, tried to escape out of the South into the North or into Canada, trying to get away from slavery itself. And then, of course, as a last result, you did have rebellions, and there weren't a lot. There were sporadic rebellions here and there, but one of the most well-known rebellions, because it was the most violent of those slave uprisings, occurred in 1831, known as Nat Turner's Rebellion, right? Nat Turner at first was a kind of like a religious minister. Um, but he saw that the treatment of the white owners, especially what were known as slave codes, right? These were the restrictions, that's all the rules that slaves had to follow, and how slaves weren't able to have an education, and slaves couldn't meet together at a certain time. And they had all of these slave codes that they had to follow. And he felt that finally the only way to get out of this institution was to actually get rid of all of these white owners. And so he and six other slaves went on this rebellion and began to kill all of these white owners and their families throughout the South, right? Mostly in Virginia is where it happened particularly. And so there was about 57 people who died because of Nat Turner's rebellion, until finally 6 weeks later he was caught, and he and all of those involved in the rebellion were executed. But as a result of this rebellion, there were actually stricter restrictions that were set in place, right? These codes became even more strict than what they were fighting in the first place. But there were rebellions that occurred, and so Nat Turner's rebellion definitely is the one that's most remembered because it was the most violent. You had the most casualties out of all of the slave rebellions. So you see here how kind of the culture and the life in the South is very different than the industrial life in the North, and how economically the North depends on the industrialization. The South still depends on agriculture, particularly cotton. You see how the institution of slavery still is a very integral part of the culture there.